Hello and welcome to part 10 of the history of Magic the Gathering, told through a card from every set. In today's episode we'll be returning to the plane of Mirrodin, but not as we know it, as it's gradually overwhelmed and overrun by terrifying invaders in Scars of Mirrodin block. And we'll then be taking a look at Core Set 2012, before closing out by going to the gothic horror world of Innistrad, a definite fan favourite. Now let's get down to business. You guys remember Mirrodin, right? The overpowered artifact plane we looked at way back in part 6 of this series? Well, Scars of Mirrodin, released in October 2010, started a new tradition of revisiting previously popular planes by taking us back to the old artifact world for another round. But Mirrodin wasn't the only returning feature to appear in Scars of Mirrodin block. Way back in 1994, Legend introduced the concept of poison counters on the cards Serpent Generator and Pit Scorpion. Whenever Pit Scorpion, or one of the serpents generated by the Serpent Generator, deals damage to a player, that player gains a poison counter. Any player who has 10 poison counters loses the game. Poison counters reappeared a handful of times after Legends, but Scars of Mirrodin brought them back in a big way. Scars of Mirrodin block tells the story of the plane of Mirrodin being slowly invaded and overwhelmed by the Phyrexians. Do you remember the Phyrexians? The original big baddies of Magic's story, who were seemingly fought off and beaten in Apocalypse in 2001. Well, they're back. The Phyrexian invasion of Mirrodin is represented through the Infect mechanic, a mechanic which makes use of poison counters and appears on our card that represents this set, Tainted Strike. Infect merges poison counters with the mechanic Wither from Shadowmoor. Whenever a creature with Infect deals damage to another creature, that damage is dealt in the form of -1/-1 counters, which means that big creatures can be gradually worn down by small creatures with Infect, and indestructible foes can be gradually blipped away. Any damage which is dealt to a player by a source with Infect instead gives them that many poison counters. This means that, if your deck is filled with Infect sources, your opponent functionally starts with 10 life rather than 20. Proliferate and other mechanics can also be used to multiply and spread the number of poison counters on an opponent, as long as they already have some. Tainted Strike is a sneaky combat trick, which gives a creature +1/+0 and Infect. It can be used to unexpectedly turn a powerful blow into a lethal one, especially in a format like Commander, where starting life totals are higher and there's more time to get out larger creatures. It's probably not quite as infamous as Triumph of the Hordes, the ultimate sneaky Infect win condition, but it's still a cunning way of scoring a backdoor victory. One final thing to mention about the Infect mechanic is how it's cleverly used to convey the progress of the war between Mirrodin and the Phyrexians. In Scars of Mirrodin, only black and green cards have Infect. This represents that there is a Phyrexian presence on the plane, but it's far from omnipresent and it's still developing. By Mirrodin Besieged, Infect is spread into blue and white, representing the Phyrexians making progress in the war and gaining more of a foothold. Finally, by New Phyrexia, Infect cards creep into red. The Infect mechanic is now spread across the entire colour pie, like a disease, representing how the Phyrexians have fully overwhelmed and corrupted the plane of Mirrodin. Mirrodin Besieged invaded stores in February 2011. As the war between Mirrodin and the Phyrexian invaders began in earnest, the Mirrans needed to arm themselves with powerful weaponry in order to better defend their world. As such, we got the next card in a very powerful cross-set cycle of equipment. The Sword cycle began on our previous visit to Mirrodin, with the cards Sword of Light and Shadow and Sword of Ice and Fire. It continued, with each set in Scars of Mirrodin block introducing a new sword, including the card which we'll be using to represent Mirrodin Besieged, Sword of Feast and Famine. Each of the swords follows a simple to understand but incredibly powerful pattern. They all give the equipped creatures +2/+2, grant protection from 2 colours, in the case of Feast and Famine green and black, and then grant the equipped creature 2 abilities tied to the 2 colours which the sword represents. So Sword of Feast and Famine makes your opponent discard a card, a black effect, and then allows you to untap all of your lands, a green effect. The swords are some of the most powerful pieces of equipment in the game, with each of them commanding at the very least a price tag of around $10. Of all of the cards in this cycle, however, I have chosen to emphasise Sword of Feast and Famine due to the role it played in the infamous Core Blade, or Core Go decks, which dominated the game whilst all of the pieces within it remained legal. These decks are still considered to be some of the most powerful decks to ever see play in Standard, and were certainly some of the most famous. Core Blade decks were brutally oppressive control decks, composed almost entirely of counterspells, removal and board wipes. Core Blade decks usually only contained 8 creatures, 4 copies of Stoneforge Mystic and 4 copies of Squadron Hawk. The card which gives the deck its name, since, Hawks go core. Hawks go core. Hawks make a cawing noise. Anyway, when piloting a Core Blade deck, your aim is to bring out Squadron Hawk, thus fetching the other 3 Hawks from your deck, and then slide a Sword of Feast and Famine or 2 into its talons, or its beak, or whatever appendage a hawk would use to hold a sword. And then you keep on swinging until it scores the kill. These swords can be tutored up using Stoneforge Mystic. Each hit you get with the sword denies your opponent resources by forcing them to discard a card and untaps your lands, allowing you to always be ready with a counterspell. Due to their controlling nature, many of these decks also ran copies of Jace the Mind Sculptor. As the deck contained 2 cards which were later banned not only in Standard but also in the Modern format, its utter dominance is perhaps unsurprising. At present, the sword cycle still remains incomplete. Modern Horizons in 2019 gave us 2 more swords, but we still haven't seen a blue and black, a red and green, or a white and green sword. Perhaps we'll see them when we next return to the plane formerly known as Mirrodin, something which, while it won't be happening in 2021, is probably due in the not too distant future, considering the presence of a certain Phyrexian Praetor on Kaldheim. Fun fact about this set: so as not to spoil the outcome of the war between Mirrodin and Phyrexia, this set was actually marketed under 2 different names. Even game stores, as they were ordering in products for the future, weren't certain if they'd be getting packs from a set called Mirrodin Pure or one called New Phyrexia. As you're probably aware, as the set came out 10 years ago, and I've made no attempt to hide its name thus far, the Phyrexians ultimately won, and New Phyrexia spread into stores in May 2011. And it brought with it a mechanic which, though innovative, ultimately resulted in the creation of several cards which are fundamentally unhealthy for the game and needed to be banned. The colour pie is a vital part of balancing Magic. Each of the colours has things it can do well, things it can do adequately, and things it can't do at all. For example, without the use of artifacts, which often don't offer a great rate for what they accomplish, if you're playing a mono red deck, you shouldn't be able to destroy enchantments. If you're playing mono green, you should have difficulty removing creatures without having some creatures of your own in play. If you're playing a mono white deck, you shouldn't be able to win the game. Okay, I'm kidding. Mono white decks aren't very good at ramp and card draw though, which are kind of important. But at this point, that's well known, and Wizards have said they're working on it. Anyway, I'm getting off the point. If you run a monocolour deck, you shouldn't be able to do everything. A mechanic introduced in New Phyrexia, however, warped that idea. So-called Phyrexian mana can be paid using either mana of a specified colour or 2 life. For example, the card Dismember costs 2 black Phyrexian mana and then 1 mana of any colour. This means you can pay for it either by paying 2 black mana and 1 mana of any colour, or by paying 4 life and 1 mana, or 2 life, 1 black mana and 1 mana of any colour. Mono blue is not supposed to have hard removal. It's supposed to get rid of its opponent's threats either by using cards like Unsummon to bounce them back to their opponent's hand, using soft removal options which lock your opponent's creatures down and prevent them from untapping, or by using counterspells. But in a world where Dismember exists, every single mono blue deck suddenly has access to a hard removal spell. In fact, every deck in the world can now cast this spell. The colour of Phyrexian mana is, for many purposes, irrelevant. Any deck which wants access to an effect granted by a card which has Phyrexian mana at its cost can include it, paying only a nominal fee in life. Now it was a toss-up between which of 2 cards I should use as my card to represent New Phyrexia: Gitaxian Probe or Mental Misstep. I'm sorry, Birthing Pod. In some ways, these are similar cards. Both saw a previously huge amount of play, both are banned in Modern and Legacy and restricted in Vintage, and both cost a single point of blue Phyrexian mana. Gitaxian Probe allows you to look at your opponent's hand and then draw a card, whilst Mental Misstep counters the spell with converted mana cost 1. Ultimately, however, I've decided to go with Mental Misstep here, as I feel it best demonstrates the problem which Phyrexian mana brings about. Not every colour should be able to counter spells, or else the game would just be madness. By giving every colour the ability to counter spells, even in a limited capacity like Mental Misstep, which only counters very cheap spells, the colour pie becomes messier and less clear. One of blue's defining features can now be employed by any deck in the game. Also, Mental Misstep can function as a 0 mana counterspell, which we established when we were talking about Force of Will is very, very powerful. So to conclude, Phyrexian mana is certainly a cool idea, but even the small number of cards which they've printed with Phyrexian mana pips in their cost have ultimately harmed the game, as they smash elements from different parts of the colour pie together and allow you to build decks which have access to things which they really shouldn't. Core Set 2012 stomped into stores in July 2011. The card which we'll be using to represent it is Swiftfoot Boots. A Commander staple, Swiftfoot Boots is an artifact with a low cost and also a low equip cost, which gives the creature it's equipped to haste, meaning it can attack on the turn when it's summoned, and hexproof, meaning it can't be targeted by your opponent's spells and abilities. This makes it ideal in so-called Voltron decks which are about building up one incredibly powerful creature, equipping it with a bunch of auras, buffs, and pieces of equipment, making it an unstoppable juggernaut, and then punching your opponent repeatedly in the face of it. In the case of Swiftfoot Boots, haste is useful, as it lets you strike with your big battlecruiser threat the turn you bring it out, but hexproof is the real utility which the card provides, as it keeps the equipped creature safe from a great deal of the game's removal. Basically, anything that's single target. I've chosen Swiftfoot Boots as my card to represent this set, just to sort of use it as a jumping off point to discuss the hexproof mechanic, its history, and why it's slightly divisive. The history of hexproof is tied tightly together with the history of another mechanic, Shroud. Shroud has been appearing in the game since Legends, but it wasn't officially keyworded until Future Sight. A card with Shroud can't be the target of any spells or abilities, whether they belong to you or to your opponent. The mechanic was retired in Core Set 2012 in favour of Hexproof, which allows you to target the creature, but not your opponent. This is allegedly due to the confusion caused by the Shroud mechanic, and players not quite getting how it worked. To quote an article on the subject, "We created this mechanic because we found players were having problems with Shroud. They understood that their opponent couldn't target their creatures, but they didn't get that they couldn't either. The intuitive belief seemed to be that your abilities only help you and not hurt you. We saw enough players doing this during various phases of testing that we decided to change Shroud into a keyword that acted the way players thought Shroud worked." Although this did solve the problem of player confusion, it created another one. Hexproof is disliked by parts of the player base due to how non-interactive it is. It forces players to use mass removal and board wipes to get rid of a single threat, or else to use removal methods which bypass targeting effects, like forcing your opponent to sacrifice their hexproof creatures, or just beating them in combat. Some find this to be obtuse and frustrating, and if you've ever been up against an invisible stalker decked out in buffs, then you'll know why. Others, however, quite enjoy the relative guarantee of safety which Hexproof provides. As mentioned, it can be used to build up big Voltron threats in Commander, but it also forms the centerpiece of so-called Boggles decks in Modern, which employ a similar strategy of gluing a bunch of auras onto a creature with Hexproof and then smacking your opponent with it until they're dead. You'll remember back in Part 6 when we discussed Kamigawa Block, how it was the first top-down set designed since Arabian Nights, and how it was built around Japanese mythology. You'll also recall that Kamigawa, unfortunately, didn't sell very well. As such, Wizards of the Coast stopped making top-down sets for a whole 6 years. Fortunately, in September 2011, the concept was tried out again, and it was a smash hit. Innistrad is a top-down block based around gothic horror, and it's marvellous, not only for its incredibly evocative theme, but also for simply being one of the most fun limited formats of all time. Google Best MTG Limited Format, and in most instances, Innistrad will either be top of the list, or very high in contention. So what makes Innistrad Limited so good? Well, to put it simply, it's a mixture of being approachable enough that beginners can enjoy it, whilst also being rich and layered enough to give even professionals pause for thought. Each of the allied colour pairs in Innistrad is based around a tribal theme. Spirits are in white and blue, zombies are in blue and black, vampires are in black and red, werewolves are in red and green, and humans are in green and white. So if you're drafting Innistrad for the first time, it's easy just to put together a tribal deck, and it'll serve you well. The enemy colour pairs, meanwhile, offer more complex and hard to execute strategies, many of which are themed around using the graveyard as a resource. These enemy colour decks reward those with the drafting and deck building skills needed to put them together. Blue and red are focused on recurring spell cards from a graveyard using flashback, ideally using the card Burning Vengeance to rack up damage as you recast the spells. Red and white, as it so often is aggro focused, white and black has a sacrifice theme, blue and green focused on self-mill, and of course, there's green and black, which is based around filling your graveyard, both to turn on the Morbid mechanic, and to build the infamous spider spawning deck, which often splashes a little bit of blue in order to get some self-mill, in order to fill the graveyard, and then to drown your opponents in wave upon wave of arachnids. But beyond its spectacular limited format, what most people remember at Innistrad is the fact that it introduced double-faced cards. As mentioned before, these are an evolution of the flip cards which were introduced in Kamigawa Block. They tell a simple but effective two-part story. Usually, because Innistrad is a horror plane, they're inspired by classic gothic horror stories. For example, the sophisticated Dr. Jekyll-esque civilized scholar transforms into the brutal Mr. Hyde-inspired homicidal brute. The card which we'll be choosing to represent this set is another double-faced card, based around a horror story. Specifically, this card is inspired by The Fly, by George Langelaan. Delver of Secrets is a 1/1 human wizard, for 1 mana. Delver gives you the opportunity to reveal the top card of your library at the start of each of your turns. If you reveal an instant or sorcery this way, Delver of Secrets transforms into the 3/2 flyer Insectile Aberration. Delver of Secrets form the core of Delver decks, which are popular in Modern and occasionally other older formats. These Delver decks are blue-centered tempo decks, which bring out early and powerful threats, like the Delver, and then use blue's counter-spell suite both to enable the Delver to transform and to stop opponents from removing him. Although these decks aren't quite the presence they once were, Delver's power level isn't quite so far above the curve now as it was 10 years ago. They're still around, and Delver of Secrets' accomplishments are all the more impressive as it's only a humble common card, which has a whole archetype named after it. It's notable that Delver of Secrets' story didn't end in Innistrad. Both Shadows over Innistrad and Eldritch Moon continue the tale of this insectile scientist who continues to press too far and to dig too deep. Shadows features the card Abhorrent Researcher, which shows our Delver friend is still flapping around having a good time before he attains a perfected form. Then, Docent of Perfection, released in Eldritch Moon, shows him getting corrupted by the Eldrazi and transforming others into bug monsters with the card Final Iteration. This card is particularly cool as it generates a bunch of 1/1 wizards and then transforms them into 3/2 flyers. This shows how he's replicating exactly the same process from his Delver days, as the new wizards he transforms have exactly the same stat line as he used to. Although these two cards are both really cool continuations of the Delver of Secrets storyline, despite their higher rarity, they never had quite the same impact on the game as the original Delver did. Alright, to loop back around to Innistrad itself now as I wrap up, I just wanted to say that there were so many cards I could have used to represent this set. So my apologies to Liliana of the Veil, Parallel Lives, Laboratory Maniac, and most of all to Snapcaster Mage. You're all still terrific cards from a terrific set. Dark Ascension rose into being in February 2012. The 3 sets per block structure, which Magic the Gathering used to adopt, worked best when it was used to tell a 3-act story. We've just discussed this with Scars of Mirrodin block, which went scary aliens show up, the Mirrans and the scary aliens go to war, the scary aliens win, and we get to see what the world looks like under their control. We've also seen this in the past with blocks like Time Spiral, which used the concept of chronology to have a past, present, and future structure. Innistrad block also follows a 3-act structure. The first act introduces us to the spooky horror plane. The final act, Avacyn Restored, has angels descend to save the plane from the horrors which prowl across it. That leaves Dark Ascension in the middle as the second act, the Rising Tension section, where the monsters of Innistrad have overwhelmed the plane's populace and all hope seems lost. Nowhere is this better represented than in the signature card of the set, Mikaeus the Unhallowed. In Magic's storyline, Mikaeus Sassani was the Lunarch, the head of the Church of Avacyn. There's a card in Innistrad depicting him in this role. To show that everything was getting worse for humanity, in Dark Ascension they printed this new iteration of Mikaeus, a demonstration of how the Church's former inspiring leader has been raised from the dead and turned against them. This idea of everything being terrible for humankind was core to the design of Dark Ascension. But the dire situation which humanity found itself in ensured that the monstrous population in Innistrad thrived and became more powerful than ever. Mark Rosewater wrote an article on the subject, but the article doesn't really display anymore if you try to load it. It's weird. So anyway, let's get a quote from his podcast instead.
But Tom Lapilli, once again, Tom Lapilli came to me. This is his first design, and he said to me, I think you're doing something wrong. Which, by the way, major props to Tom. That takes a lot of guts. I mean, this is my 15th set. I'm the head designer. I design a lot of sets. To come up to me and say you're doing something wrong took a lot of guts on Tom's part. But Tom was correct. I was focusing so much on the humans dying that I wasn't focusing on what Tom thought. He goes, the humans dying is part of the story, but really what this set's supposed to be is monsters are awesome. You're focusing on the humans are not. So instead of focusing on the humans or not, let's get a little more focused on the monsters are awesome.
This idea is demonstrated perfectly in the card of Mikaeus. His top effect destroys any humans that damage you, making everything worse for mankind. His bottom effect buffs every non-human you control and raises them from the dead, making things better for Innistrad's monstrous population. He also has Intimidate, because, he's a scary zombie man. So I'm using Mikaeus the Unhallowed to represent Dark Ascension because he's a microcosm of the set's broad theme. That whilst everything is terrible for humanity, and it's their darkest, most fateful hour, everything's going really well for the plane's monsters. We've looked at some pretty bleak sets today. We've seen the plane of Mirrodin slowly overwhelmed by horrifying alien invaders, and we've seen things go from creepily bad to horrifyingly worse on the plane of Innistrad. Fortunately, a happy ending's in sight. Or at least a happy ending in terms of the storyline. Avacyn Restored flew onto shelves in May 2012. Just when things seemed bleakest for the people of Innistrad, their angelic protector, the Archangel Avacyn, burst out of the Hell Vault in which he was trapped and rode to their rescue. She set the monsters of the plane to rout and gave a little bit of hope to those trapped on the most godless plane of the multiverse. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given that her name is in the set's title, Avacyn, Angel of Hope, will be our card to represent Avacyn Restored. Whilst within the plot, Avacyn is considered Innistrad's saviour, this stands in marked contrast to the way which Avacyn Restored is typically perceived. Whilst Innistrad is considered one of the greatest limited formats of all time, Avacyn Restored is considered by many to be one of the absolute worst, and many of the problems with the format can be seen by looking at the card of Avacyn herself. In an article written for Channel Fireball in 2011 about the 5 worst formats in the history of the game, pro player Owen Turtenwald says, quote, I went to a Grand Prix where the format was AVR sealed, and it made me want to quit Magic. Yes, it was that bad. I didn't even recall why it was so bad, but my god, it was horrific. I love Magic more than anything in the world, so a format that made me want to quit cold turkey is impressive. Although Turtenwald, in his article, doesn't offer specific criticisms, there is a vast dialogue out there regarding the faults of Avacyn Restored. Probably one of the most common complaints is that the mythic rares in the set were way too powerful. This is demonstrated by Avacyn. As at 8 mana, she's expensive to get out, but once she hits the board, not only is she an imposing threat, but she makes every creature you control indestructible. Some other mythics from Avacyn Restored are also pretty crazy. Craterhoof Behemoth is the best green win condition in the game, Gristlebrand is a modern staple with the power to draw you an absurd number of cards, and Temporal Mastery is functionally the power 9 card Time Walk if you cast it on the turn that you draw it. There's also Tybalt Fiend-Blooded, who I guess is the exception which proves the rule. In any case, the point is that the majority of the mythic rares in Avacyn Restored were game-warpingly powerful. This issue of very powerful mythics was compounded by the fact that Avacyn Restored was deliberately designed as a format where removal spells would be few, far between, and for the most part at least, terrible and underpowered. This was a deliberate design decision, as is noted in an article regarding the set on Wizards of the Coast's website. When the full set of Avacyn Restored was spoiled, players were surprised. Where was all the removal? Red gets a sorcery speed shock, the pacifism effect in the set is defang, even black has to spend X just to kill a creature. So why was the removal so bad? Well, for the answer to that, let's look at the Soulbound mechanic. Soulbound allows players to pair their Soulbound creature with another creature they control, granting both a beneficial bonus. Sounds neat, right? And well, whilst this is certainly a neat effect, its effectiveness gets reduced significantly if either of the bounded creatures can be killed. Thus, to make Soulbound work, the removal in Avacyn Restored was tuned way down. This demonstrates how the problems in Avacyn Restored's limited gameplay were all linked together. Designing a format where Soulbound would work meant neutering the removal suite. This exacerbated the problem of the format's many powerful mythic rares, and all of this came together to leave a bitter taste in the mouths of many players. I just want to say before I close though, that if you like Avacyn Restored, that's great. It gave us some really awesome cards, and though its limited gameplay is hugely unpopular, that doesn't mean it's universally despised, and you're more than welcome to love it if that's your personal view. And that's the end of part 10. Scars of Mirrodin block followed the precedent set by the original Mirrodin block and broke the game. This time with crazy Phyrexian mana, rather than with busted artifacts. Innistrad brought top-down design back to Magic in a major way, and changed the game by introducing double-faced cards. It's a shame that it ended on what's broadly regarded as a bit of a low note, rather than rising to an angelic chorus with Avacyn Restored. Next time we'll explore the core sets of 2013 and 2014, as well as Return to Ravnica for the block Return to Ravnica. Before we finish here though, wow. When I started this series last summer, I would never imagined I'd make it out of Classic Board of Magic, let alone that I'd make it to the end of Innistrad block. We're in 2012 now, so we're only 9 years away from the present, or the present as I'm recording this video at least. Thank you all for coming along with me on this ride. We're inching gradually closer and closer to completing this, and I'm just incredibly flattered by all of the kind comments which you guys have left and all the support which you've given this project. Let's keep on going.